On this episode of Newt's World, on Wednesday, July 23rd, President Trump released Winning the Race, America's AI Action Plan, which includes 3 pillars. 1. Accelerate AI innovation. 2. Build American AI infrastructure. And 3. Lead in international AI diplomacy and security. The United States is in a race to achieve global dominance in artificial intelligence. The country who leads with the largest AI ecosystem will set global AI standards and realize broad economic and military benefits. We're on the verge of a new industrial revolution, an information revolution and renaissance. Here to talk about the AI Action Plan, I'm really pleased to welcome back my guest, Neil Chilson. He is the former technologist for the Federal Trade Commission and current head of AI policy at the Abundance Institute. Neil, welcome and thank you for joining me once again on Newt's World.
Thanks for having me.
You know, one of President Trump's first actions in January was to revoke President Biden's executive order on AI and sign Executive Order 14179, removing barriers to American leadership in artificial intelligence, directing the creation of an AI action plan. From your standpoint, how does the Trump administration's philosophy on AI differ from the Biden approach?
You know, it's 180 degrees different. The Biden executive order, which was the third longest in history, laid out a long series of things that the administration was concerned about AI. It framed AI as a risk primarily and tried to deploy the entire federal government to mitigate that risk. The Trump administration repealed that executive order, and this action plan lays out their plan, and it takes a very different framework. It looks at AI as a giant opportunity, as you framed it up. It's a industrial and information revolution wrapped in with a renaissance and has huge potential benefits for the United States if we seize it and if we win the race. And so the entire action plan is under that frame, and the policies that it suggests are largely commercially driven with some boosters from the government, including some deregulatory efforts that sort of form the backbone of several of the sections, several of the pillars that you talked about. So it really is very different, both in approach and policy from the Biden administration.
Well, you know, back in January, the Trump White House announced the creation of Stargate, a public-private partnership with $500 billion in projected investment. In your judgment, how significant is this for U.S. AI competitiveness?
To compete globally on AI, we need a lot of infrastructure. That's energy infrastructure, but it's also data centers, these big computer warehouses that do all the actual work for the AI algorithms. And so I think those types of investments are super important. They're critical. There was another one that Trump just announced along with some Pennsylvania folks just last week or maybe the week before that was around $90 billion in investment. And so these types of large investments, primarily driven by the private sector, are really important to continued U.S. leadership in artificial intelligence.
AI actually relies on enormous amounts of computing, and enormous amounts of computing really rely on a tremendous amount of electricity. There's a whole infrastructure behind whatever happens when we go online and interact with AI.
That's why one of the 3 pillars in the AI action plan looks at clearing away some of the regulatory barriers that make it so hard to build new energy and connect it to the grid in the United States. We have a real challenge here. As far as supply on energy, we've sort of flattened out since the 70s. We haven't built a lot of new capacity. And that's a problem, given that it would be great for Americans who are using all sorts of services if energy was too cheap to meter. We have the technological ability to do that. Lots of times, regulatory barriers get in the way.
I have a friend who's very deeply into modular nuclear and just signed a contract, I think, with Amazon to put a modular nuclear power plant next to every one of their computer centers.
That's a great idea. I love it.
Before we get much deeper, because I was going to ask about the recommendations that the Abundance Institute has issued, but first, I think it'd be helpful for most people. Tell us just for a minute about the Abundance Institute.
So the Abundance Institute is a mission-driven nonprofit that's very focused on emerging technologies. We're unabashed optimists about the ability of technology to drive widespread human prosperity. We see from the lessons of history that that has been what technology has done in the past. But it doesn't just happen by itself. It takes two things. It takes a culture that embraces innovation rather than fears it, and it takes a regulatory environment that enables it. And so we are dedicated to fostering both of those situations. I spend a lot of my time on the policy side and a lot of focus on AI, but we do a lot of work in energy, including small modular reactors, like you mentioned, the policy environment for that. And we're looking at other technologies that are coming down the pike that will need both policy and cultural support to really reach the full impact that they could to bring benefits to people.
In March, your institute issued a comment on request for information on the development of an artificial intelligence action plan. And there's something like 1,000 AI-related bills under consideration at the state level. What's your whole sense about what degree can we allow states to micro-regulate, and to what degree does this inevitably become a federal preemption?
There is a real challenge here because AI is a general purpose technology, and defining it is quite difficult. It's a moving target. And so I often say to state regulators, what if you just replaced what you're talking about as AI with advanced computing, and then asked whether or not your legislation makes sense? And I think the challenge is so much of this flood of state regulation has a reach that goes beyond the borders of the state. No doubt there are plenty of applications of artificial intelligence in things like insurance, where the states have a traditional role of governing those types of uses and should continue to. That's part of our constitutional federalist system. But when states start passing laws where the effects are very broad, way beyond their borders, in fact, could be global, then I think it's incumbent on the U.S. federal government to step in and say, hey, actually, some of this is our role, right? And we've seen some examples from states like New York where sponsors of bills that are sort of comprehensive in the broad scope regulatory approach to AI, where their stated position is that they want to have a national or a global effect. And that really is something that goes beyond the framework of the Constitution. And we're talking about things that really should be governed at the federal level. And this AI action plan recognizes that challenge and that problem. And I think it starts to move in the right direction to say, like, hey, actually, there's a strong federal role here.
Well, and I think that the Founding Fathers' intent was that there would be certain interstate commerce things that have to be dealt with nationally. As the former Federal Trade Commission chief technologist, you had a front row seat to Trump's 2019 and 2020 executive orders on artificial intelligence. I'm very curious, how does this first Trump administration compare with what the second Trump administration is now doing?
There are some big differences. Primarily, I think the first Trump administration took longer to get going, right? There wasn't the team on the bench ready to go. And so I think that one thing we're seeing here is that this AI action plan is a great example of this second administration really having an agenda coming in, being ready to start executing on it, putting this together based on an EO that came out the first day that Trump was in office, and then executing on this, what is a quite comprehensive set of ideas in such a short time, I think just demonstrates the difference in the level of preparedness to hit the ground running that this administration has compared to the first time.
Explain for average citizens why it is so important for the U.S. to have global dominance in artificial intelligence.
So as a general purpose technology, artificial intelligence is important because intelligence is important. If you can put more intellectual horsepower behind solving problems and you can offload some of that to computers, we can really expand the number of problems that we solve. And this means in spaces like healthcare, transportation, entertainment, defense. And so part of the reason that this is important is that the U.S. right now leads in this space. We have major competitors, though. In particular, China is developing their own tools to solve these same types of problems. And this is particularly concerning, I think, in the defense space, but also just economically. The U.S. will benefit if the majority of the world adopts our technology and our infrastructure, our AI stack, as they would call it, to build the problem-solving tools of the future. And so I think that's why it's really important for the U.S. to stay ahead here. There's also a cultural component, which is that artificial intelligence models capture a lot of the ideas of a country. And so I think just from that aspect, we would much prefer that the U.S. ideas of liberty, of capitalism, of entrepreneurship are those that fuel a lot of the tools that other people use around the world rather than Chinese Communist Party inflected AI models.
It's been fascinating to me that the United States has really emphasized innovation, and the Europeans have really emphasized regulation. They're really a fascinating case study and two cultural approaches. And as you know, the European Union now has a code of practice on artificial intelligence, I guess, which is called the AI Act, which would put a lot of different controls, if you will. What's your sense of the European approach?
So it's fascinating. The Europeans were really far along the road. They were so advanced in AI regulation that they were writing a very comprehensive EU AI Act before ChatGPT came out. And in fact, when ChatGPT came out and it was very different than the way that they had been thinking about AI, they had to do like sort of emergency revisions to their EU AI Act. So it was almost out of date even before it passed. And so this code of practice is a sort of voluntary, I'm air quoting that for your listeners, it's a sort of voluntary set of commitments that if companies sign on to, then the European Union will say, okay, we're going to assume you're complying if you follow all of these particular conditions. But as you point out, those conditions are extremely detailed. They're extremely onerous. And some of the companies have refused, some of the US companies have refused to sign on, probably assuming that the European Union is going to sue them no matter what. And that's probably a good assumption in this space. And so that approach of regulate first and maybe hope to carve out some innovation later has been the European approach, and it's failed pretty badly. And in fact, I think there is some recognition within Europe that this is a problem. There has been some pushback. Some of the major European companies like Airbus have signed a letter to the European Union saying that the EU AI Act implementation needs to be delayed because nobody can figure out how to comply with it and still build useful products. And some of the countries that have AI companies, France has a company called Mistral, which does quite a lot of innovative AI work. France has been pushing back pretty hard on the EU Act as well. So you know it's bad when France is pushing back on it.
That's right. And I understand that Meta has basically said they're not even going to touch it.
That's right. I think Meta is one of those companies that has said the European Union is going to sue us no matter what we do in this space. We're not going to do this voluntary commitment that would essentially paint a target on our back after the European Union regulators have sort of loaded the bow and arrow. And so Meta has chosen not to sign on.
Could the Europeans paint themselves into a corner where literally the really biggest companies could just decide not to be there?
I think that's a possibility. I mean, I think what we've seen even more so is that the Chinese, especially in the hardware space, the Chinese developers have rushed in to fill the gap where American companies have been sort of pushed out by the Europeans. The Chinese companies rush in to sort of fill that gap. Huawei did that with 5G hardware. I think there's a real concern that if we don't get, and you see this in the AI action plan, if we don't get the global market, if we somehow keep our allies and our friends from adopting US tech, then they'll end up adopting Chinese tech. And so I think China sees that as the game plan. And I think we need to do what we can to make sure that our friends and allies can build on the American tech stack. That's really important.
We've really seen a dramatic tightening of export controls for chips and for other things that go into AI. Candidly, I can't quite tell which generation of chips are now embargoed and which chips are okay and how big the difference is in terms of capabilities. What's your sense of that whole effort to control exports, particularly to China, of very, very advanced chips?
So I think that was the initial strategy of the Biden administration had a very sweeping called diffusion rule, which actually set a lot of export limits on a lot of our friends and allies, countries like Israel and Portugal. And there wasn't really a clear reason why, but that continued into the Trump administration. I think we're seeing, especially with the ongoing development of China's own infrastructure, that if we don't sell them some level of chips, they will build their own capacity. And we're just letting their own domestic providers proceed without any competition if we don't sell chips into there. And so the Trump administration did allow for, I would say these are about 3-generation back chips. They're about 17% of the capacity of the top line GPUs that we have right now. And so they're not nearly as good as the cutting edge technology, but they are being allowed to be sold into China. And I think that makes a ton of sense. If we see China as a rival, we still want them building on the American tech stack. I think that's great because it means that even if their models get exported elsewhere, they'll run the best on the hardware that they were trained on. And right now, we want that to be the American hardware.
What would you say in this ongoing race? Is it essentially between the U.S. and China, or are there other countries who have significant AI capabilities?
So it is essentially right now between AI and China on many of the dimensions. China has the largest collection of software developers in the world. And so they are the major competitor. There are lots of other regions that want to get into the AI business, but they'll largely probably build on either US or Chinese hardware and software. And so when we look at the deals that the Trump administration struck with some of the Middle East countries, UAE and some others, part of the motivation there is these countries have a lot of capital to spend. They want to build large data centers and develop AI. And if we don't make that deal with them, China will.
There's a lot of concern that somehow artificial intelligence relates back to Schwarzenegger movies and all that stuff. Do you see AI as a serious threat or as a tool? How do you think about it?
I think of AI as a tool. Like I said, I think of it as advanced computing. When I was first getting into computers, the cutting edge of AI was chess playing. And now everybody's phone can do that. When I was in high school, I think the cutting edge was optical recognition, the idea that a computer could recognize an object. Now everybody's phone can do that. Text recognition, voice generation. These all at some point were considered the cutting edge of artificial intelligence. Now they're on everybody's phone. Nobody really calls them artificial intelligence anymore. I think that's going to continue to be the trend as this specific set of chatbot tools get integrated to lots of different services. We'll probably stop calling it artificial intelligence and we'll just call it computers again. There'll be something new that is being generated. And so I really do think of it as a tool. These are not personalities. They don't have will. They are really sophisticated tools that can help us think through patterns in language and music and art, but they don't replace humans, I don't think. And I think we can really use them to amplify our intellectual abilities like a steam engine. But a steam engine, wasn't a muscle. It wasn't a human just because it could do some of the things that a human could do. And so I think of them very much like that, a steam engine for the mind.
Yeah, of course, the era of the steam engine also was the era of Frankenstein and of the whole notion of these artificially developed monsters.
The mythology around being replaced by the things that we build is very, very old, right? And so that fear is somehow ingrained in humans. And I think it's just being played out in this new context of intelligence.
The one area that when we talk about exports, et cetera, it's sort of astonishing what percent of the world's advanced chips are on Taiwan. Doesn't that make Taiwan, in a sense, strategic in ways that people don't often think about it?
I think you're absolutely right. What the Taiwanese have been able to do with building chips at scale and very quickly developing the types of tools to manufacture in a very consistent and high yield way the types of chips that power so many of the devices is pretty impressive. It's pretty unique, frankly. But it does mean that Taiwan is strategically important to the U.S. in the supply chain of semiconductors, for sure.
The other thing which has always surprised me, and maybe you can help explain it, is modern chip production requires a massive amount of investment. To build these modern chip plants at the level of controlled detail that which they manufacture is an astonishing achievement.
It really is. And part of that is because they produce at such high yields. They produce at such scale. And that's the only way you can get the cost of these very, very complicated devices down enough so that normal consumers can buy them. And so your iPhone, if we had to produce them at a smaller scale, would cost maybe 10 times what it costs right now. Or it might not even be physically possible to make if you didn't make it at that high scale. So the amount of capital investment that these companies had to put in to build manufacturing capability is really high. The U.S. made some policy choices way back when that made it harder for us to maintain that capacity here. We benefited a lot from the ability to purchase that capability from other parts of the world. Now there's a push to bring it back, but I think people are realizing it's not just the dollars. There's a lot of skilled personnel and talent and know-how that is really important in being able to produce the type of quality and scale that Taiwan has been able to achieve.
Didn't the Taiwanese discover that when they had an opportunity and a commitment to build a very large facility in Arizona, they just couldn't find the workforce?
Yeah, it was very hard. In fact, I think they had to bring a bunch of people from Taiwan. They had to try to persuade them to move from Taiwan to move to Arizona. And I think they really did struggle with that. I think some of that has been mitigated a little bit. Over time, I think they've been able to work out some of that. But it certainly is a barrier. It's hard to port a culture from one place to another. And bringing the culture that enabled Taiwan to build these massive factories to Arizona has been a little bit challenging.
Apparently it requires such an intense focus on detail that it's not part of the traditional American patterns. Let me ask you one other thing, which is when you think about your institute, what would you say are the major developments of the near future that you all are focused on?
I'm very focused on AI, but again, that's a general purpose technology. So to be a little more specific, I am very excited and very interested in the implications of artificial intelligence for medicine. And in particular, there is a growing body of evidence that we are able to use some of these models to identify new uses for already approved drugs. And many of these uses can be targeted towards the types of diseases that maybe only 100 people in the world suffer from at a time. Those types of diseases never get specific drug research because it doesn't make sense to try to build a product for 100 people. But in aggregate, there are many of these types of diseases. And so if we can use these AI models to repurpose existing approved drugs to solve or mitigate some of these diseases, I think there's a really huge impact that we could have on people's lives right now, even with the technology we have right now. And that's only going to get better in the future. And so I'm very excited about this type of drug personalization, the ability to target some of these very difficult to solve medical problems that many people suffer from.
I've been talking for years about the idea of turning disabilities into capabilities. And it seems to me we're right at the edge of the technologies, which is literally going to make that possible.
I think you're right. And it's a really exciting time to be in this space.
That's why I think when you think about all this stuff, I'm very optimistic that if we can avoid a nuclear war and avoid losing to China, that over the next 20 or 30 years, we really will have an extraordinary golden age of new developments, new technologies, new opportunities. And sort of being at a place called the Abundance Institute, you almost have to believe that.
I was going to say it's an abundant future, I think, if we get some of these policy things right. And I think the AI action plan does move us in that direction.
I hope, because this is going to continue to evolve, it's going to be a lively process to watch. So I hope you'll consider in future coming back and keeping us updated as all these opportunities keep developing. And I hope people take a serious look at the Abundance Institute. Neil, I want to thank you for joining me. I want to let our listeners know they can find Winning the Race, America's AI Action Plan, at whitehouse.gov, and they can learn more about your organization, the Abundance Institute, by visiting your website at abundance.institute.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you to my guest, Neil Chilson. You can get a link to Winning the Race, America's AI Action Plan on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.